So, welcome to Bible 101, number 24. Can you believe it? This is our last session before we take a summer break. And tonight we're going to talk about the interesting and important question, what crucified Jesus? And we will also spend a little bit of time talking about the resurrection. And I want us to take a look at the crucifixion of Jesus through the lens of passion plays.
Excuse me, can you get closer to the mic?
Oh, okay, sure, you bet, Liz.
Thank you.
Let's see if is this working better? And we may need to adjust the number. How's this? Is this better? Can you hear okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about the crucifixion of Jesus through the lens of passion plays. Passion plays are characteristically and notoriously difficult and painful for Jewish-Christian relations. And here in a nutshell is why that is. It's because the Gospels underplay Roman authority and responsibility while accentuating Jewish authority and responsibility for the death of Jesus. There may be a single passion play that several of us have seen. It was a film by Mel Gibson in 2004 called The Passion. Cannot hear me?
No, now you're fading.
Well,
It's faint.
Try again. How is this? Vicki made an
Well,
adjustment.
that's
Is this
fine.
better?
Yeah, much better. I can hear you now.
Okay, then we'll start over again. We're talking about passion plays. Passion plays are difficult for Jewish-Christian relations, and here is why. Because they base the story on the stories of Jesus' arrest, trial, and execution. The Gospels, as they do this, as they talk about the death of Jesus, the Gospels underplay Roman responsibility.
No one that was in the room.
Esther, we're hearing on your end too. The Gospels underplay Roman authority and responsibility. The Gospels accentuate Jewish authority and responsibility for the death of Jesus. So let's think a little bit about this in light of passion plays, and one in particular, and it was a movie by Mel Gibson called The Passion, 2004. If you saw that, raise your hand if you saw it. Anybody see it? Okay, we've got 3 of us who saw it. It led to a lot of discussion about the death of Jesus and who was responsible. So let me ask, in addition to the 3 of us who saw the movie, have any others of you seen a passion play?
Mm-mm.
Okay, Judy has. Christina, you have?
Yeah, I did once.
Okay, so a number of us have. And a passion play starts off generally with a triumphal entry, goes through the fateful Holy Week, then leads to the Last Supper, the betrayal by Judas, the arrest of Jesus, and so on. In the gospel accounts of Jesus' trial, there are 2 key actors, and this was true also in Mel Gibson's movie. The 2 key actors were Pilate, the Roman governor, who is named at the trial, and he appears in all 4 of the Gospels. Caiaphas, also the high priest, who appears only in Matthew and John. Caiaphas's name never even appears in the earliest Gospel, Mark, and I think that is significant. Think about it. Caiaphas is only in Matthew and John. What do you remember when we were studying Matthew and John about any references to Jewish religious authorities or the Jews? What do you remember?
Matthew was a Jew and he totally ended up switching his viewpoint as he wrote, like pro-Jew, anti-Jew, I think.
Indeed. And what led to that? Do you remember? In the liturgy of the synagogue, by the time that Matthew was writing the gospel, the synagogue had been so worried about these Jewish Christians that they wrote an anti-heresy, anti-Nazarenes, i.e. anti-Christian segment in their liturgy. So it became impossible for Jews who were also followers of Jesus with integrity to worship in the synagogue. And John, you will remember, constantly refers to Jesus' enemies as the Jews, because John is a late gospel as well. Now, there is another lesser figure who appears only in Luke's account of the trial, and that is Herod Antipas. If you've seen Jesus Christ Superstar, you remember a kind of, well, he's the George III, if you've seen Hamilton, comic actor in Jesus Christ Superstar. Herod Antipas had jurisdiction in Galilee. In Passion plays, but also in the Gospels, we also have Roman soldiers who mock and scourge Jesus. These were quite understated, just mentioned in the Gospels, but in Gibson's movie, they were brutal and interminable. The high priests of the Sanhedrin are other characters. That's the Jewish High Council. And then you also have crowds of Jewish people whom you will remember in one of the Gospels, or actually in several of the Gospels, eventually cry out, "Crucify him." So that's the cast of characters. Anybody ever been to Oberammergau? It's in Bavaria. Yes, Judy has. Is that where you saw the Passion play?
Unfortunately, I just drove through there just to see what it looked like, but it was the wrong month for the Passion plays.
Oh, okay.
Beautiful setting.
Yeah. In Bavaria, in Oberammergau, every 10 years since the Middle Ages, remember the Middle Ages ended in the 1500s, this little German town has put on a Passion play, the story of the death of Jesus, and they have done it because they took a vow. If they would be spared from the plague, they would do this, and they were spared from the plague. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, and remember, we're not that far away from then, Oberammergau sought out rabbis and listened to them in order to figure out how could they tell this story in a way that would not be understood to be anti-Jewish, because that had been a problem for centuries, and anti-Semitism has been a problem in Germany for a very long time, and most notably, of course, we know, in the 30s and 40s, but well before that, and since. Here's what happened in Europe in the Middle Ages. During Lent, Christian worshipers would emerge from Good Friday services where they had heard about the villainy of the Jews, and they were frequently characterized as Christ killers. And people would come out of Good Friday services, Christian people, and would charge into Jewish neighborhoods in order to pillage them, loot them, beat people, and sometimes murder Jewish men, women, and children. That happened under the auspices of Christian Lenten services, Good Friday, the story of the death of Jesus. And the gospel accounts and the ways they've been read, non-historically and non-critically, have unfortunately tended to fuel Christian anti-Semitism. Remember now, when the Gospels were written, they were written decades after the events that they describe, and by the time Matthew and John wrote, The synagogue, as we've said, has long since closed itself off from considering Jesus to be the Messiah. And as we said a few weeks ago, the separation from synagogue and church was a bitter divorce. Now, when the Gospels are being written, Christianity is beginning to take hold all throughout the Mediterranean world, and Gentile citizens, citizens of the Roman Empire, are responding to the gospel and are converting and becoming followers of Jesus the Christ. Now, at that time, who's very powerful? Rome is very powerful. Rome is the empire, and Roman persecution of the church, of the Christians, had already begun. Now, that is the setting in which the Gospels were written. And it would have been foolhardy for the Gospel writers to tell this story of Jesus' death in such a way as to make Christians appear even more treasonous and aliens from the empire. And so in this telling, at least 30, maybe 40, maybe 50, in the case of John, even perhaps more years after the death of Jesus, this story, as it is told in the Gospels, becomes more pro-Roman and anti-Jewish. So that Pontius Pilate is portrayed, you know this story, as reluctant to execute this accused man. Pontius Pilate is represented as being kind of wishy-washy, really. The Jewish authorities, who, mind you, are under the thumb of Rome, have Roman soldiers, armed Roman soldiers all over the place. Nevertheless, the Jewish authorities are depicted in the Gospels as being somewhat dominating. And here's a really tough question. How was it that Jesus was executed?
How was it?
What was the instrument of his execution?
The cross.
A cross. Now, was that the Jewish means of execution?
No.
What was the Jewish means of execution?
Stoning.
Stoning.
Shooting.
Okay. Now, there is a reason why Jesus was crucified and not stoned, and this is why. If Jesus had been stoned, Roman Catholics would need to bless themselves by going like this. Tim, what I just did was beat myself on the head, representing a stoning. Okay, that was the humor for the day.
Instead of a cross.
Instead of a cross, instead of this. Yes,
Got it.
got it. Okay, all right. I'm glad you spelled it out. Now, who were crucified in this time by the authorities of the Roman Empire? Crucifixion was ordinarily reserved for rebels against the Roman state. It was reserved for fomenters of sedition. And they were impaled outside the city along highways, so that this punishment would be so visible, so starkly in your face, that it would have the maximum effect as a deterrent against treasonous action. That's who was crucified. Now, let's take a look at the first written gospel. That's the gospel according to Mark. With me, will you find Mark chapter 11? And we're just going to rather swiftly move through the chapters just to see this last week in Jerusalem unfold. We begin in chapter 11, and there we find what?
Palm Sunday?
the triumphal entry.
Triumphal
That's-
Day.
We
Yeah.
find the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, which we celebrate on Palm Sunday. And then we move to the cleansing of the temple, in which Jesus turns over the tables of the money changers. See that? It's verse 15 and following. And then in chapter 12, begin a series of challenges to Jesus by the religious authorities, mostly the scribes and the Pharisees, and we see Jesus' very skillful rebuttal. He will not be trapped by their arguments. Then in chapter 13, Jesus teaches about the last days, the end time, and it sounds in his teaching as if it is coming soon. Then in chapter 14, we find that a plot has surfaced against his life. And I'm wondering if you can hear me. We have gone blank. Oh, are you there? Could you hear me through that? All right, our screen went blank. Then in chapter 14, Judas is enlisted into this plot. Then, as we know, come the Last Supper, the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus' arrest. And before the high priest and the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin,
Who enlists
we are
Judas?
still in chapter 14. Liz, what?
Who enlists Judas? Judas?
You can
Jude.
find who enlists Judas. He went, find it in chapter 14, verse 10.
Hmm.
Judas went to the chief priests.
He
Yeah.
went to them.
That's the way it is told.
Yeah.
Yeah, Judas.
Yeah. Appearing before the high priest and the Jewish council, we're still in chapter 14. We find in his trial before the council, before the Sanhedrin, that verse 58, he's found to be a blasphemer. Okay? He was presumptuous in relation to the temple, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple. See it? And then in verses 61 and following, he's accused of making a messianic claim. And Matthew has Jesus' response to be, you have said so. Luke has Jesus say, if I tell you, you will not believe. What do you have in Mark? Are you the Messiah? What does Jesus say?
You say it.
You said so.
I am.
I am.
I am. And so, verse 64, the Sanhedrin finds Jesus deserving of the death penalty. Now, you see the account of Peter's denial. And then, chapter 15, Jesus is delivered over to Pilate. And you remember Pilate's response to the charges against Jesus. Verse 5, Jesus is silent before his accusers, and Pilate is what?
Against him.
Amazed.
He was
Amazed. And so Pilate, under this pressure, as the story is told, under this pressure against Jesus, Pilate offers the choice of two possible individuals who are on the verge of or have been condemned to death, either Barabbas or Jesus, and Pilate leaves it up to the crowd, right? Which, in verses 11 through 13, makes their choice. And in verse 14, when the crowd says, release Barabbas, in other words, crucify Jesus, in verse 14, Pilate is apparently incredulous. And verse 15, okay, That's what you want. He accedes to the crowd and, quote, hands him over to be crucified. Okay? That's the basic story as told in the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels.
Why would they have him crucified if that's for political prisoners?
Well, that's a good
Instead-
question. Let's let it linger and not
Okay.
try to answer it now. If crucifixion was for those who were seditious or treasonous, why would they have Jesus crucified? Hang on to the question. We'll return to it. Now, this is the basic story in the earliest gospel. Remember, Matthew and Luke have this gospel, and Matthew and Luke make some embellishments on the basic story they got from Mark. Basically, I want to point out an embellishment in Matthew, and I want you to find it. It is very important. It is why Passion plays have been so egregiously interpreted as accusing of the Jews. You'll find it in Matthew chapter 27, verse 25. Let's find it. So here's the crowd. Pilate and is up high, along with Jesus, bound, a prisoner, and Barabbas, bound, a prisoner. And the crowd has said, crucify him. And in Matthew, Pilate washes his hands, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. And then comes this horrible, self-accusing blood curse in which, in the Gospel of Matthew, the crowd shouts, find it, Matthew 27, verse 25, his blood, Jesus's blood, the Christ's blood, be upon us and on our children.
Children.
Yeah.
Those are tragic words to find in the Bible because these words have especially led to deadly violence against Jews. I will tell you, the last time Vicki and I saw the Oberammergau Passion play, they had done such a hard bit of work trying to find out how can they be true to the gospel accounts and not have the crowd of the Jews say that. The last time we saw the Passion play, I think that was in 2000, was it not? Or was it 2010? I'm not sure.
2000.
2000 probably. Okay, it would have been oh yes, it was 2000. And they at Oberammergau, they do it every 10 years. The last time we saw it, those words, his blood be upon us and our children, was spoken only by a few voices, and those were the voices of the high priests. Those words were not spoken by the crowd, which was, 2 cheers, not 3 cheers. It was still there, but it was an improvement. Now, I want us to zero in on 2 figures. We will zero in on Pilate and the chief priest Caiaphas, who, I remind you, is not named in the Gospel according to Mark. In Mel Gibson's movie and in other Passion plays I have seen, a Pilate is represented as kind of an uneasy administrator. He doesn't quite know what to do. He is distressed at the prospect of having to order this man's crucifixion. Mel Gibson imagines a non-biblical scene in which Pilate and his wife are privately conferring, and the troubled governor, Pilate, laments to his wife how imperial life, with its endless cycle of repression and rebellion and repression and rebellion, has pulled him into the shadows where truth is obscure. And so this scene this scene in the movie The Passion invites us to understand Pontius Pilate as a man who is caught up in and trapped in the larger, rougher, more violent forces of his time. That he's kind of, he's one of the victims in the story, in the way this story is told. Now that raises this question. If Pilate is understood sympathetically in Passion plays, and to an extent understood sympathetically in the Gospels, couldn't the same have been done for Caiaphas? Because in fact, in the Gospels, there are grounds for understanding Caiaphas, the high priest, in a sympathetic way. Let's turn now to the Gospel according to John, chapter 11. I'm talking loudly and close to the microphone. Are you hearing me okay now?
Yes.
Good.
Pretty well.
Okay, we're going to John chapter 11, where we will find biblical grounds for seeing the high priest Caiaphas sympathetically. Now, this story is in chapter 11. You may remember the chapter in John. What happens in chapter 11? Jesus' good friend Lazarus is raised from the dead. This comes immediately after the raising of Lazarus and beginning with verse 47. John chapter 11, verse 47. The chief priests and the Pharisees call a meeting of the Sanhedrin and ask, oh my goodness, look at the kind of attention he's getting now. What are we to do? If we let him go on like this, do you see, I'm reading from the text, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place, what's that?
The temple.
The temple, and our nation. Now, this is written after the Romans had in fact destroyed their nation, had destroyed the whole city of Jerusalem, okay? So if Pilate has his troubled tale to tell that is emphasized in Passion plays, well, look, so do the members of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish High Council, and their fears about the Roman threat to their temple and their people, which they are charged to protect, those fears form the basis for a proposal by Caiaphas that you find in verse 50. Look for it.
Verse 49.
He says to the fellow members of the Sanhedrin, others of the high priest council, it is better for you, the council, to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed. Mel Gibson, in his movie, portrayed Pilate sensitively, and Passion plays tend to as well. But Caiaphas and the other high priests and the bloodthirsty Jewish crowds are not explained, are not understood, are not seen sympathetically, but are treated as the implacable face of evil. And they become caricatures. And here's the problem with that. This is rather characteristic of Passion plays that have gone back at least to the Middle Ages. When it comes to Passion plays, Christian caricatures of Jews lead all the way to Auschwitz. Now, let's ask some questions about setting this in historical context from what we can know from other sources. Was Pontius Pilate an indecisive leader? Was Pontius Pilate uneasy about meting out capital punishment? I'm going to read to you from a couple ancient sources. First, the philosopher Philo. This is the way Philo describes Pontius Pilate. A man of very inflexible disposition and very merciless, as well as very obstinate. The ancient philosopher Philo speaks of Pilate's corruption and his cruelty and his continual murders of people, untried and uncondemned, and his never-ending and gratuitous and most grievous inhumanity. Close quote. Pilate, says Philo, was, I quote, exceedingly angry and at all times a man of most ferocious passions. That's one ancient secular source. Here's another one, the Jewish historian Josephus, also ancient. Welcome to Terry. Hadn't seen you before, man. Okay, welcome. The ancient historian Josephus records that on another occasion, a crowd came before Pilate's tribunal to demand that he, Pilate, remove from Jerusalem the pagan images on his military standards. Okay, there were images of the deities of Rome. Pilate surrounded the crowd with soldiers 3 deep. This is from the historian Josephus. And people were saved from the slaughter only by a willingness for martyrdom. But the next time they tried the same non-violent resistance, Pilate infiltrated the crowd with soldiers dressed, quote, in Jewish garments, under which they carried clubs, and many of the crowd were slain on the spot. There are 2 other accounts of the kind of rule exercised by Pilate in Jerusalem. Ancient historians describe Pilate as ruthless, a bloody ruler, one who crucified many people. Definitely do not describe him as a weakling, not a pawn of the high priest. Pilate represented the brutal Roman occupation of Israel in a harsh way. Okay, I just put that there before now asking the question. So, who killed Jesus? What killed Jesus? And the answer, I would suggest, is certainly not an either or. I would suggest, based on what we read in the Gospels, what we know from alternative historical records, is I think we can say that a particular set of Jewish leaders and the Roman rulers found a convergence of interest to get rid of Jesus of Nazareth. That Jesus' message and Jesus' activities were a threat that were both religious and political. His activities and his message was a religious threat, but also a threat to the political authorities. So I would suggest, I think we can read between the lines, that Pilate and Caiaphas have made an arrangement. They have made a deal. They've worked out a compromise. It may not be the best, but they think, under the circumstances, it's the best that they can do. And both of them believe they are acting in the best interests of their people. Pilate is working in the best interests for the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. The peace of Rome was keep a lid on it. Don't allow rebellion and revolution to occur. And Caiaphas, trying to hold on to the last shred of freedom for his people, the Jews. I mean, Caiaphas and the other priests are simply trying to keep the temple open. This is the precious symbol of their nation's history and identity and their worship of the Lord God Yahweh. Now, with me so far, I'm going to pause if you want to raise a question because I want to introduce another character. And I will.
Okay, question. I have a question.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, Pilate and Caiaphas, they are Romans or they are Jews?
Caiaphas
Well-
is the Jewish high
High
priest,
priest.
the head of the Sanhedrin, the high Jewish council, who are in charge of maintaining worship in the temple in Jerusalem. Caiaphas is very Jewish, quintessentially Jewish. Pilate is the Roman governor under the authority of the Roman Empire. The Roman emperor said, okay, Pilate, you take care of this place. And there were governors all over the entire Roman Empire. Pilate has Judah.
Okay, because when I was reading this earlier today, there are specific verses in the Bible that referred to the Romans as the killers of Jesus. And also there were specific verses in the Bible that referred to the Jews as killers of Jesus. So it's kind of, confusing to me who
It is.
actually killed Jesus.
And that's what we're going for right now. Okay? That's what we're going for right now. So I want to introduce, we've got a cast of characters that includes Pilate, Caiaphas, Herod Antipas, haven't heard much about him and we really won't, and Barabbas. Okay? Let's consider the figure of Barabbas. What is he all about? Let's take a look now back in the Gospel according to Mark in chapter 15.
This is not the Barabbas that they chose. This is another Barabbas, right?
This is the Barabbas who is given as an alternative. Do you want me to
Okay.
release Jesus or do you want me to release Barabbas? Pilate asks in the
Okay.
Gospels.
All
Okay.
right.
So, what is Barabbas about? Let's take a look at what Mark says in chapter 15, verse 7. What does Mark 15:7 tell you? Somebody might read it aloud.
A man called Barabbas was then in prison along with the rebels who had committed murder in a rebellion.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. You in your translation have rebellion. In my translation, I have insurrection. Rebellion, insurrection. What does that tell you about Barabbas?
Was some kind of a leader.
Some kind of a leader. A leader of what?
Maybe he was a zealot.
Maybe he was a zealot. Barabbas, it appears from this verse, was a leader of some Jewish freedom fighters. If they're fighting for freedom, who are they fighting against?
The Romans.
The Roman.
The Romans. Yes, this is probably a zealot leader. And naturally, this is one who's fighting for us. We in the crowd, the Jewish people in the crowd. And what happens? Verse 8. Well, what happens is what you would expect to happen. The crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. And you remember the custom at the Passover was he would, okay, I'll release a prisoner for you. Who will it be? Now, why would this crowd choose Barabbas? Release Barabbas?
Because he was
Also was a leader. They are Jewish leader.
Against
Rome.
Roman occupation, Roman colonization, Roman oppression. Then I would suggest to you that this crowd that we will later see, of course, cries crucify, this is not so much an anti-Jewish, an anti-Jesus crowd as we've always understood this to be an anti-Jesus crowd. This is a pro-freedom fighter, pro-zealot, pro-rebel leader, a pro-Barabbas crowd. And if that is the case, that makes a huge difference, does it not? This crowd shouting crucify because they want to save their hero, Barabbas, are an oppressed people, a colonized people. They are getting a chance to rescue their hero, their champion, and to get him to be freed. Now, could Pontius Pilate have viewed Jesus as a bigger threat than Barabbas? Well, you would not have thought so at the time, but centuries passed, and who was it who conquered the Roman Empire? Was it Barabbas?
No.
No.
No, it was Jesus Christ who conquered the Roman Empire. Ironically, Jesus was perhaps the more formidable figure over against imperial power.
Hmm?
Both Pilate and Caiaphas want to keep the lid on. This is an explosive situation. This is Passover. What are they remembering at Passover? They are remembering the Exodus. They are remembering the poor oppressed people finding a way to get around the oppressor. They are remembering Moses' leadership against the king, the Pharaoh, against the emperor. This is a combustible situation, and so it would appear that Pilate and Caiaphas independently decide that for the peace of the city, for the peace of the empire, for the peace of the Jewish nation, for the preservation of the temple, Jesus must die. I think they both did it. The Gospels would make it appear that Pontius Pilate, oh gosh, I really don't want to do this. You made me do it. I think they both wanted to be done with Jesus
Is
for
this
their own reasons.
this the same crowd that the week before were cheering Jesus?
That's the way we have tended to tell it in our Sunday school lessons. That's the way we have tended to tell it in sermons. I don't know that this is the same crowd. It makes for an interesting parallel narrative. I don't know. Let's take a look at John chapter 11. I've cited it already, but I want you to find it, because it's in chapter 11 that Caiaphas says in verse 50, the theological truth of this. I mean, we've been looking at the historical question, the sociological question, the power dynamics question, but the theological truth is it, and this is what Christians have proclaimed in the centuries since. Chapter 11, verse 50, one man would die for the people. One man would die for the people. Yeah. Now, I just need to remind those of us who saw Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. His story is just a one-dimensional story of Jesus as Braveheart. If you saw Braveheart, this was same character, but now Jesus is Braveheart. It is bloody, it is gory, but what's interesting is the nuances that we do find in the Gospels that we seldom find in the Passion plays. The Gospels are full of deep, divine irony. The people who are supposedly following Jesus, his disciples, at the end betray him, Peter, and desert him. Virtually all of them, with the possible exception of the beloved disciple. Another deep divine irony that even though Barabbas is the enemy of Roman occupation, it is actually Jesus who will conquer the Roman Empire. And those who are supposed to be Jesus' enemies, both religious and Roman authorities, unwittingly are the ones in the gospel stories who follow him. When the Roman soldiers robe Jesus and crown Jesus as king of the Jews, their mockery is an unconscious, unknowing kind of truth-telling, isn't it?
Mhm.
And when they crucify him, crucifixion being the prototypical Roman instrument of death, especially for those who are deemed to be treasonous or seditious, that instrument of death becomes transformed into what for us as Christians is the deepest, most profound symbol of eternal life and abundant life. Time to pause for your comments or questions before we take a shift and talk a bit in the time remaining about the resurrection. But let me pause here and see what you'd like to say.
When you look at this on a theological level, okay, I was reading a commentary last week, and they said there are four possibilities. One was the Romans killed Jesus, or the Jews killed Jesus, or me and you killed Jesus, or his father killed Jesus.
Oh, yes, okay.
Okay, so I'm saying this theologically. And
theologically, yes.
Yeah, okay. So in the first case, as what we have been discussing so far, we can understand the rationale for the Romans. Because I think in Matthew 27, 35, it says the Roman soldiers had crucified him. Okay, and if you look at some other verses in the scriptures, they said it was the Jews.
Right.
And then theologically, it says that it was because of the sins of you and me that led to the crucifixion of Jesus. And finally, they say that the Lord, God knew that Jesus was going to be crucified. So he must have been a part of the process of killing Jesus. How do we reconcile those four things?
Oh my, Jude, that is such a remarkable summation of 4 points of view. Thank you for that. Let me not try to play the answer man on that. So, class, who wants to weigh in on that? Did the Romans kill Jesus? Did the Jews kill Jesus? Did we kill Jesus? Did God kill Jesus? Weigh in.
Well,
Your
I was-
turn.
I was thinking about the question posed to us for tonight, and my answer was the fourth one. It was God's will. It was the plan all along.
Yeah, you. What happened?
I agree.
Okay.
I enjoyed this assignment too, Kent, and I found some various things, but I've always thought it was all of us. And one time I shared that with my third grade Sunday school class, and they weren't all that happy about it. But I would say, if we would have been back there, we would have been saying crucify him. So I think all of us did.
I think there is, go ahead. Yeah. Was that Christiane?
Yeah, I think all of us did, but it was the will of God. God had planned it to happen that way.
I think this is an important thing to ponder and not to have a facile answer. It could indeed be all of the above, couldn't it? It could
Yeah.
be indeed all of the above, depending on the angle and the depth with which you are thinking about this. I think it's a good thing to ponder and let just kind of hang in our minds and souls.
I think it has to be all of the above. Revelations, we're going to be all one.
Okay. Okay.
And up until the conquerors through the world, up until they get to Jesus, now they've got this Jewish fall guy, and that's for the rest of history. It's the Jews that are the fall guys.
There's a lot of that. You may have noticed my sister Nancy is not with us tonight, and I was talking with her a couple days ago and telling her what we would do tonight. And she, who is quite the literary scholar with her master's in English, and she taught it in college for a time, said, and yes, that's the way the medieval morality plays were. In the medieval morality plays, which were not necessarily passion plays and coming right out of the Gospels and right out of the church, always the evil one was some Jew in medieval Europe. And I said, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that. We thought a little together about where did this come from? And we recalled that in the Middle Ages, when the Church of Rome was culturally very important, it was the Holy Roman Empire, that one of the prohibitions for Christians was they were not to be usurers. They were not to lend money to make money. That was forbidden, and you can find scriptures that do say that. Well, who's going to do it then? We're not allowed to do it. Let's find some non-Christians to do it. Okay, hey, the Jewish people, they can do it. They don't have a prohibition against it. And so the Jews were made into money lenders. And then it didn't take too many generations to go by that of course, we resent those who are saying, hey, you owe a debt and I'm coming for it and you're going to have something foreclosed. And so the resentment was on the money lenders, and the resentment on the money lenders was very quickly a resentment against those money-grubbing Jews, and it just fed into the anti-Semitism that she says you can find in the morality plays, and then we find this whole tradition of passion plays that pick up on it as well. Let's leave that wonderful 4-part. Jude, if you can find what your source was, I'd love to find it sometime.
Yeah.
Photocopy it or whatever. I just love it. Who crucified Jesus? The Romans, the Jews, we, or God? And we've kind of said, you know, there is grounds to say yes to all 4. Let's move on if you're okay with that. Something you said, go ahead. Yes, Sam.
No, move on. Sorry.
Okay, all right.
I was going,
said, go ahead,
I-
go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say probably 3, the Romans, the Jew, and us. I don't see how God should be in there too.
No, I don't either.
You don't see how what should be in that?
God.
God. Well, there are a
Well.
couple of people who said very much that, in their view, is the answer. Why is it that God led to the crucifixion of Jesus? Who would like to take a flyer at that?
It was
It's part of the fulfillment.
predestined. It was predestined.
Yes, it's the fulfillment.
Predestined.
That's what it is. Yeah.
Predestined.
Because we have to choose God. It's our free choice.
Okay, we will move on, but let's let it hang. Let's let it hang. And Esther, I would say one clear, broad-brushed theological response to God calls it, if God is all-powerful and all-knowing, if God knew in advance what was going to happen, God's knowing what was going to happen meant that God, who is all-powerful, would have caused it to happen. but I'm not opting for number 4 as over against 1, 2, and 3. They all have this, you know, Jude, your 4 alternatives could make a whole year's class, couldn't it? And that's why we're going to move on. Something I said earlier is that the prototypical Roman instrument of death, the cross, is transformed into what for Christians is the prototypical symbol of eternal life, abundant life. And of course, the reason for that is that Jesus' death by crucifixion is not the end of the story. But at that time, it sure looked as if it was the end. And for this, I want to read now from Key and Young's Understanding the New Testament. Hear this. After his death, the handful of Jesus' disciples and friends who had followed, fearfully but hopefully, would have felt nothing but bewilderment and despair. Their only bond was a memory that was fast being swallowed up in the memory of the cross. It was a fearful, death-dealing finale for the little community that had gathered together in expectation of a great day for the people of God. The miracle they had expected had not come. Now it was too late. But then something unprecedented, astounding, and profoundly life-changing happened. And these defeated, dispirited, despairing failures, and they were that, would never be the same again. Let us turn now to John chapter 20, a chapter we looked at last week, but it's time to look at it again. When someone is found John chapter 20, I would like that person to read aloud the first 10 verses. John 20, verses 1 through 10.
The empty tomb.
Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary of Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the stripes of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the stripes of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from the scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes.
That's it. Now, the oldest record of Jesus' resurrection that we have in the scriptures is the one from the Apostle Paul that we find in the first letter to the Corinthians, and let us turn to it. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Once you've gotten there, I'm just going to walk you through it. I'm going to start with verse 3, in which Paul says, I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received. So he's saying, don't just believe me. My authority is not the basis of my saying it. I was given it. And in saying I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, what Paul is doing here is using a rabbinic formula. The rabbis would say, this is authentic. This is authentic tradition because it got passed on to me. I did not make this up. That's what Paul is saying here in verse 3. And what was this authentic tradition that Paul had received? So we'll take a look now at the remainder of verse 3 plus verse 4.
Would that be when he was struck down?
No. That was too quick a response. He is saying that he's heard it from eyewitnesses. I handed on to you of first importance why I'd received that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. So he's saying, I didn't make this up. I've heard this. This is what's been told to me. And you got to remember, of course, Paul is not one of the original disciples. We know he comes along later. Liz has reminded us when he comes along later. We also know he did not have the best credentials for being credible in the Christian community. He was a persecutor. So, because he doesn't have all these good credentials, he's got to rely on those who do have good credentials. And so, what does he do in verses 5 through 7? He lists the eyewitnesses. He lists the people from whom he had heard. Leaders of the early Christian community, starting with whom? What does it say? Who?
Cephas.
Cephas. Do you know who Cephas is? That's an Aramaic name for
Peter.
That's Peter. First on the list is Peter. And then you see a number of people from whom he has heard this story. They were eyewitnesses. This resurrection happened. They saw it. And last on the list, verse 8, it's Paul himself. And this is a kind of a chronological listing of appearances, and it's in keeping not only with the strategic role that Peter played in the circle of the 12 disciples as kind of the leader, but it's also in keeping with the gospel's insistence that Christ appeared to Peter. Now, Paul obviously has left some people off the list, hasn't he? Have you noticed any category of people that he's left off the list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection?
Women.
Women. I knew I could count on you, Nana. Yes, he's left off the Marys. But, okay, way to go, Paul. You did it again. But these are eyewitnesses. And as Paul wrote this, probably in the AD 50s, many of them were still alive. The readers could check it out. They could ask them the same story and get the same response and the same testimony that Paul had gotten. And being an eyewitness, it turns out, in Jerusalem or in Galilee, was not going to be essential in the long run. Look, for example, at verses 8 through 11. Last of all, he appeared to me. And man, I don't qualify. I was a persecutor. But by the grace of God, oh well, it is what it is. I am what I am. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we proclaim, and so you have come to believe. Now let's go back to John 20. if you can do that.
John what?
John 20. We're going back to John 20. That's just where we were. Sorry to get you back and forth, because this is what the Gospel of John says now 40 years later, 40 years after the 50s when Paul wrote that. And at the beginning of the chapter 20 in John, John wrote the story that Jude just read to us about the women at the empty tomb. And then, verses 19 and following, there's this appearance to the perplexed disciples. He's in the room, and how did he get here? Didn't even come through the door. Somebody's not there at this appearance. Who is it?
Timothy, Thomas.
Thomas. And verses 26 and following, Jesus comes back again, and this time Thomas is there. And what happens?
He has to prove to him.
Jesus, the resurrected Christ, proves to Thomas, the doubting one, that it really is he, even lets him touch his hands where the nails had pierced him, even lets him touch his side where the spear had pierced him. But you know, that's not going to be possible for everybody, you know? That happened for Thomas. So what does John have to say? John says, you know, that kind of hands-on, face-to-face, touch the wounds verification is not going to be possible for long. What about the rest of us? How are we going to have reason for believing? And so John answers the question, and he writes it the beginning of the second half of verse 29. Have you believed because you have seen me? The risen Christ says to Thomas, blessed are those who have not seen, present company included, right? And yet have come to believe. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you, who will not have the privilege that Thomas had, who will not have the privilege that the eyewitnesses had, no, not even have the privilege that Paul had from hearing from the eyewitnesses, but these are written so that you will come to believe, nevertheless, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. So the appearances of Jesus risen from the dead were for Paul and for the 12 and with the 11 and for the women and for countless others. They're definitive proof that God's new age that they had come to expect had indeed dawned. And if there is any proof for the resurrection of Christ, it is to see what happens to these people. Remember where we left them. We left them on Friday. They were defeated. They were depressed. Peter was guilty. The disciples had fled. They are scared. It's all over. What happens to them?
Pentecost.
They become the most bold proponents of a triumphant faith. They have gotten their lives back. They have a story to tell. They have been given faith and hope back, and they now will exemplify a kind of courage and confidence that will be willing to face death and will in fact lead to death, certainly for Peter and for Paul, and they will turn the world upside down. If there is one evidence for the resurrection of Christ, it is the life-changing experience from Friday to what happened in the rest of their days. I have completed what I planned to share for tonight, and the time is, we got 5 minutes at best. Anybody?
Did we find an answer to what we were discussing last week, who the beloved disciple was?
Oh,
Not Peter.
Not Peter.
Not Peter, not Peter. In fact, we find the beloved disciple out racing Peter, don't we?
Peter
Yeah,
says, "How about
I did some reading,
Okay.
and the majority of what I read pointed to Peter, to John.
Yeah.
However,
yeah,
a convincing evidence to show that it was Lazarus. So I think we might not have enough time for me to go into detail about that. We can do two things: either to cancel the summer break and continue next week,
yeah."
or we take this up when we come back from summer break. You know?
Oh, Jude,
Yeah.
you're wonderful. Well, isn't that interesting? Could it be John the gospel writer?
Yeah.
Could it be
Lazarus?
Could it be Lazarus? Could it be symbolic of the kind of discipleship that the author of the gospel hopes that everyone who would aspire to be?
Ah,
Yeah, I think that's
Jude, you know what? I think we're back to your four alternatives again, right? Or all of the above. Okay, hey, it has been wonderful. I have enjoyed it so much. We are going to take a break. Let me tell you when we will resume, and I can assure you that we will get the information to you about when we resume as we get closer. But we're going to resume 1 week earlier than originally indicated. And I'll tell you what, I'll send you a new syllabus. But we're going to resume on Wednesday, September 8th. Because I think, given the long break we will have taken, instead of just jumping right into the Acts of the Apostles, it would be good to have a week just to recall a little bit the story of the life of Jesus of Nazareth that the Gospels tell, because that's really kind of the bedrock for what comes later. And what I'm going to do is share with you the theses of a fascinating book by Marcus Borg that when I read it, and I think it was published in 1987, just blew me away. And I want to share it with you. And then on September 15, we'll get into the Acts. But next week, Jude is holding a seminar, and he will let you know how you'll be able to connect with him. And it will be on various theories of who the beloved disciple is. Jude, the ball is in your court, brother.
okay. Well, that will be in person.
Okay. Well, friends, thank you very much. I'll see many of you between now and September 8th, but those that I will not, have a wonderful 2.5 months, and we'll resume.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Wonderful time.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
thank you.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye
Very
all.
fascinating.
Bye.